This is Gunpei Yoko. He is synonymous with the Game Boy and Nintendo's approach to design, and yet, back in the 90s, all that he wanted was to leave Nintendo desperately and never look back. The events that got him there and defines alliances and drama that created the devices that you love is the story for today. It's the end of the 40s, and a certain young man called Hiroshi Yamauchi had just moved to Tokyo. He tells everyone he's here for university, but in reality is running away from the pressures of his family, who only seem to care about work and the family business. His plan was to stretch his university days as much as possible and live a careless life of hedonism and enjoyment. But it was not to be. Barely had he established himself in the new life when terrible news reaches him. His grandfather was dying, and his last wish was the worst thing that he could have come up with: leave the company to Hiroshi. The company was, of course, Yamauchi Nintendo, a card-making business. What the hell was he supposed to do with a card-making business? If he had been cursed with this company, he was going to drag it into the modern world, no matter how much the traditionalist employees of his own family screamed and kicked. Some of his ideas, like Western-style plastic cards and even a partnership with the Walt Disney Company, had proven tremendously successful. But decades pass, and he was getting pretty tired of being a card company. If they were to survive a new era, he needed to diversify, find new things to make. But he was not a product idea man. How in the world was he going to find the idea that will finally get him beyond cards? As he toured the card-making factory mindlessly, something incredible happened.
What the You! You're the maintenance guy we recently hired! What the hell is that?
I'm sorry, sir. This was just some toy I designed with spare parts on my free time. I promise I won't slack off today.
Yes! 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 Yes!
As you probably have figured by now, that maintenance man was called Gunpei Yoko, and his amazing talents for making toys had quickly been put to work by Yamauchi. His first order was to turn his invention into the Ultra Hand, which will become an extraordinarily successful toy. Over the span of more than a decade, Yokoi's brilliant mind will bring forth an unprecedented number of innovative toys that will become staples of Japanese childhoods and turn Nintendo into a local toy-making giant. And even see them experimenting with electromechanical games for recreational parlors. But it all came crashing down abruptly. 1977, as he rides a train back from a business trip, Yokoi's thoughts linger on the delicate position of the company. He needs an idea for a hit product, and he needs it soon. Japan was barely recovering from a catastrophic oil crisis that had wrecked the economy and nearly bankrupted Nintendo's game efforts and basically rebooted the entire global tech industry. And I seem never to be able not to talk about this oil crisis because I have mentioned it in a million videos. It is in the same train ride when Yokoi notices an extremely bored businessman punching random numbers on his pocket calculator to pass time. This is an often repeated origin story for Nintendo's games, but there's a lot that has been misunderstood from that story. From the extensive research done by gaming historian Florent Gorges in his History of Nintendo, what Yokoi thought of was some sort of analog toy, nothing at all like the calculator the man was holding. But then his boss, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had an odd request.
Yokoi, you drive a foreign car, right? With the wheel on the left?
Yes, I do. What does that have to do with anything?
The driver of my foreign limousine is sick, and you're the only person in the company that can substitute him. So, come on!
What? I'm not your driver. Oh, okay. Boss, I was watching a bored salaryman playing with his calculator in the train, and I think I got an idea for a product. We should make a small calculator-like size toy for people traveling.
Oh, this is my stop. Can you take it around, please?
1 week later.
So, Yokoi, I want to introduce you to someone. This is my friend from Sharp Corporation to talk about your idea.
My idea? What idea?
Your idea of making toys for salarymen using calculator components.
Calculator components? That's not what I meant. Wait, that could actually work.
And just like that, over a series of coincidences and miscommunications, the idea of the portable electronic game came to be, with the calculator and tech company Sharp as the main technological partner in the project dubbed Microgame. Amazing. Okay, but wait, why calculator components? Why was Sharp so interested in this idea? Starting in the 60s, a technological race was taking place for the next major revolution in personal electronics. Up until that point, displays for computers and devices rely on CRT technology, which was very heavy and notoriously difficult to miniaturize, not to mention very difficult to run on batteries. While we will never know if given enough time we will all have been walking around with nuclear power wrist-size CRTs, a certain George Hillmeyer of the Radio Company of America discovered a way of blocking light with liquid crystals that could be electrically controlled, and soon researchers in the world immediately realized this technology could potentially create flat, energy-efficient displays. The race was on. What you need to know is that Hillmeyer's original technology, known as dynamic scattering mode or DSM, lacked contrast and required a constant electrical current, which killed batteries and was very difficult to use for color displays. Then a physicist called Wolfgang Helfrich expanded on previous research on liquid crystals and started figuring out a potentially better solution. His employer, the American giant RCA, was not interested, so he quit and went to the Central Research Laboratories of Holman La Roche in Switzerland to continue his investigation. This led to the invention of twisted nematic displays. How this works is actually simpler than you will expect. As you might know, light is a wave. What you might not know about is a property of light called polarization, which is basically the orientation of these waves. For example, this will be vertical polarization and this is horizontal polarization. Ever wonder how those polarized anti-reflection sunglasses work? Well, most natural light has no specific polarization, it's just all over the place. But the light that bounces off a surface tends to be polarized perpendicular to that surface. Then, it is relatively simple to create a filter that blocks or lets through a specific polarization or orientation. The human eye is mostly incapable of distinguishing the polarization of light, so this works. Twisted nematics are crystals suspended in a liquid at a 90-degree angle, like half a spiral. When light goes through the crystal, it changes its polarization by 90 degrees. Now, when a small voltage is applied to the crystal, they align with the field and stretch into a straight formation. Now, they let light through without any changes in polarization. Now remember how polarized glasses are basically filters and only let light through if it has the correct orientation? Let's add a filter similar to that to make sure all incoming light has the same polarization, and another one at the end, just rotated 90 degrees. Now when there is no voltage, the light rotates and goes through without problems, but when voltage is applied, the light does not rotate and is blocked, and you get a device that can control the path of light with a small controlled voltage. Then, finally, add a reflector at the end of the mechanism, and you get the basic building block of a display that can be read under a light. RCA might have dropped the ball on this innovation, but the Japanese were ready to pick it up. In September of 1973, Seiko released the first TN LCD watch, the 06LC, and a commercial war was ignited. As the 70s progressed, Japanese watch and pocket electronic companies battled for LCD supremacy. By the 80s, Japan had irrevocably taken over the LCD industry from the Americans, and they will dominate this display industry for a long time. The war between Japanese companies to improve on this technology flooded the market and made LCDs very, very cheap, with their primary use case being calculators and watches. And so, Sharp had a huge surplus of calculator components that could be used for alternative projects. And now the hard part, they had to find a way to make this idea into a real product. It had to be a timeless aesthetic that would be fun to play, attractive to all ages, and be the size of a business card holder, so salarymen could play discreetly on the train, and be achievable using the limitations of current calculator components. The last bit was not a small consideration. The calculator processor they had access to was designed for an 8-digit calculator, with each digit utilizing 7 segments. Counting the dots and the minus sign, that means in total it could drive 72 segments. If you use 4 numbers to track the score, that is only 44 segments to make an entire game. Not an easy feat. But from these limitations, a juggling game called Ball was born, with 3 planned variations accessible through buttons. 2 problems arose though. The first was price. The device was on its way to a retail price of about 5,800 yen, which was higher than they would have desired for what is essentially a toy. The second is that try as they might, Yokoi could not conceive of an alternate game mode for the third button. Eventually, he realized he could solve both problems with one solution. What if the third button turned the score counter into a clock? That way, it was no longer a slightly overpriced game, but a highly affordable digital watch. The micro game had become the Game & Watch. Now, the only thing standing in the way of the project was getting a full green light from Sharp. As Yokoi showed the prototype to the engineers at Sharp, they were less than enthusiastic.
Look, I'm not going to lie, there are a number of engineering challenges we will have to solve here, and are you really sure you want to make a device using these parts? This calculator technology is ancient, it's nearly obsolete.
Just think about it, okay? I'm going to leave our prototype here so you can try it when you like.
And wouldn't you know, on the next meeting the engineers had changed their tone. Maybe they had their fun with the device and realized the value of what they had been handed. Playing is believing. Either way, the experience of Sharp engineers combined with Yokoi's ingenuity made it possible to solve every issue they had encountered, including the tendency for the filters to generate the very annoying neutral ring optical effect, which Yokoi reportedly solved by creating small indentations in the screen, which he achieved using Nintendo's card cutting machines. That led to the characteristic dot pattern that all Game & Watch devices have. The game was ready to start production. But as Yokoi presents his new product to Yamauchi, his reaction is disconcerting.
Just one? You move this many people in Nintendo and Sharp to make one product?
Do you want me to make another?
You know making products in even numbers is bad luck. Make me 3 models.
And so Game & Watch will release with 3 games: Ball, Flag, and Vermin. Optimistic, Nintendo set an estimate of 100,000 units sold in 3 years, which will make it a very successful toy, and as it hits store shelves, Yokoi holds his breath and waits. The first set of Game & Watch devices will sell 100,000 units in 2 months. With kids being the biggest fans, which was a surprise given the aim at businessmen and the high price. As you can imagine, this will launch Yokoi into a design frenzy that will have him create so many models and series of Game & Watch devices that there are entire encyclopedias on it. More importantly, the enormous hit coincided with another small miracle: the creation of the Donkey Kong arcade game that will be a smash hit in America. Together, these 2 hits had saved the company and propelled Nintendo towards a new era dominated by technologically complex toys and games. But from the sidelines, one man watched, and as the success of his peers increased, so did his anxiety. His name is Masayuki Uemura. Uemura was an engineer originally from Sharp Corporation who had been poached by Nintendo and appointed as the head of the new team of Research and Development 2, a division dedicated to hardware development. This young team have found some success already. The Japanese giant Mitsubishi, yes that one, approached them to develop the Color TV game series of single-game home consoles on which Uemura had learned a fair deal about product design. But the success of those consoles had been eclipsed by the colossal impact of Donkey Kong and the Game & Watch, to the point that employees of R&D2 were constantly leaving to work on the more promising rival team. For a while, Uemura found himself with so little to do that he would just go home early. But one of those days, President of Nintendo Hiroshi Yamauchi had something important to tell him.
Uemura, we have to... Oh, I think he went home.
Hello?
Uemura, listen. Video games are definitely the future, but we need to move away from the very sketchy reputation arcade parlors have. Nintendo's image is being ruined! What we need is arcade-like games somewhere more acceptable, like people's living rooms!
Uemura could already feel his nervousness rising. Expensive American-style cartridge consoles hadn't quite clicked with the Japanese public, and their marketplace was saturated already with single-game models. This will not be easy. Oh, finally Yamauchi dropped the 2 most important details. It had to be priced at 10,000 yen and be ready by mid-next year. As unreasonable as this order was, it was pretty much the only chance Uemura had to not become completely irrelevant in his company, and so he gave it a real swing. Okay, so capable of running arcade titles is a bit general, so this objective got simplified to being able to run Donkey Kong, Nintendo's arcade hit. But that did not make the challenge any less intimidating. Nintendo had licensed their arcade hits to many console makers before, from Amstrad to the ZX Spectrum, many of which were arguably not capable machines for this task. Arguably the only successful conversion was the ColecoVision port, which proved the difficult nature of this task. And finding someone that could make a CPU and integrated circuitry with this capability at such a low cost was hard. Nowadays, top-of-the-line CPU technology is so complex that there's literally a handful of companies that fabricate all the CPUs in the world. But back in the 80s, microprocessor technology was going through a boom, and lots of tech companies were trying to get on the game, especially in places like Japan. Sharp would have been an ideal partner, since Uemura himself had worked there, but paradoxically, Yamauchi unexpectedly forbade any collaboration between Sharp and Nintendo for the new console. The reasons are not clear. Maybe Yamauchi did not want Nintendo to over-rely on one partner. But the bad part is that every other company Nintendo reached out to basically lost Aomura out of the room when they heard his price and functionality requirements. And just as he was beginning to think the project will be cancelled over pure inevitability, Nintendo's legendary fortune struck again. In Japanese, one of the interpretations of Nintendo's name is "leave luck to heaven," as in work hard and leave luck to the gods. And for Nintendo, heaven seems to often be on their side. The photocopier and printer company Raiko was one of those companies that had inexplicably decided to jump into the microprocessor manufacturing business, expecting a gold mine. Millions were invested to create their factory. The gold mine had quickly turned into a nightmare, though. The lack of external contracts and Raiko's lower than expected cheap demand meant that rarely the factory was operating at over 10% capacity. Big and expensive factories are not free to keep around doing nothing, so Raiko executives were desperate to get something, any contract whatsoever, if only to keep the plant costs paid. Word had reached their ears of Nintendo's Uemura asking around for a company for a large order of microprocessors, so proactively, Raiko representatives reached out to Nintendo to get the details of the product. One of those people was Hiromitsu Yagi, an ex-Mitsubishi employee that had worked with Uemura during the TV game console project and, maybe out of desperation, assured Uemura that his absolutely insane requirements of a processor able to run Donkey Kong at a tiny price were possible. However, Raiko's proposal was unexpected in a number of ways. In a nutshell, they propose a very standard design that splits the task between two main parts: a cheap CPU that will interpret the game's logic and a custom-made PPU, or picture processing unit, that will take care of populating the screen with graphics. You can see for yourself evidence of this dual nature of the console within some of the earlier, simpler Famicom games, as you can notice how the chip containing the game logic and the one containing the graphics are literally wired to different halves of the cartridge. On the CPU side, they proposed basing the product on a MOS 6502 CPU. The thing is, this was a very weird proposal. But to understand why, let's take a short lesson in the early history of inexpensive CPUs. During this time, there were two major worldwide players in the fight for affordable 8-bit microprocessors, the Zilog C80 and the MOS 6502. And yes, we have made videos about the history of both. The Zilog Z80 in particular had taken the Japanese industry by storm and was the CPU powering pretty much every big Japanese arcade hit. Pac-Man, Galaxian, Galaga, Donkey Kong Jr. You name a Japanese arcade hit at the time, and chances are there's a C80 inside. But that microprocessor is not the one Raiko wanted to use. No. They wanted to use the other one, the 6502. This meant Nintendo will have no developers familiar with it, they will have to hire some in a country where barely anyone doing games knew what to do with it, and they could not recycle any code or logic from their arcade games, making the porting process much harder. On Nintendo's side, you can see why they accepted this weird proposal. They pretty much had no other options for manufacturers. But why was Raiko insisting so much on this CPU that had such clear disadvantages? And here's when things get really interesting. Most of my stories of this time come from the History of Nintendo Volume 2 by game historian Florent Gorges, on which it simply states that Raiko had the exclusive license for the MOS 6502 and they just used it. But this claim runs into several issues under scrutiny. According to I Am Error by Nathan Altis, there's a lot of suspicious stuff happening around the Famicom CPU. For starters, the license for that CPU was owned by a company that could be considered a competitor to Nintendo. MOS Technology, the company that invented the CPU, was acquired by Commodore in the 70s, an acquisition they very much leveraged to succeed with aggressively priced computers using the CPU, including the legendary Commodore 64 that became the basis for a huge gaming industry. More importantly, Commodore CEO Jack Tramiel had significant interest in blocking Japanese competitors from eventually participating in the US games market, having several previous businesses fail against Japanese competition, and as some speculate, fueled in part by post-World War II anti-Japanese sentiment, something that is hard to fault him about with just a cursory read of his biography. So it is difficult to believe Commodore and MOS will have licensed their CPU to Raiko. And sure enough, a document explicitly stating that MOS licensed the 6502 to Raiko is yet to be found. Okay, suspicious? Sure, but none of this is quite groundbreaking. The real surprise came much later. Years after our story took place, when Nintendo finally started bringing their consoles to the US, people at Commodore suspected something weird was going on and got some of their engineers to investigate. Commodore 64 programmers Robert Russell and one of the original 6502 engineers, Will Mathis, investigated the Nintendo console and did some interesting discoveries. They scrapped the NES chip down to the die and discovered that it was exactly a 6502 with one major modification. The module that allowed for binary coded decimal operation was present but disconnected from the main chip. Okay, why is this important? Well, turns out the law that allowed chip designs to be copyrightable was established in 1984, that is, after the release of this device. That means that during the time our story takes place, if you wanted to legally protect a chip from copying, you had to use a patent. Now, if we take a look at some of the patents for the MOS 6502, the decimal operation functionality is a big part of it. So removing that functionality, even in such a crude way as just disconnecting from the model, was theoretically enough for Raiko and Nintendo to avoid a lawsuit from MOS. But the shenanigans do not stop there, because we still have to talk about the other main element of the design, the picture processing unit. Once again in the book I Am Error, Nathan Altes points out that clearly the impressive ColecoVision port of Donkey Kong had left an impression in Nintendo, since this chip bears a striking resemblance in terms of functionality to the Coleco's video display processor, with the Raiko chip having very similar key functionalities and asset tables. Was this engineers simply drawing inspiration from a system they knew was nearly capable of the main task? Or was the very suspicious licensing situation of the CPU also being repeated here? It's hard to know, but one thing's for sure, possible copyright infringement is only fun when Nintendo is the one doing. Either way, thanks to Raiko's desperation on getting their factory moving, they had made an offer to Nintendo that finally could make Yamauchi's impossible idea just viable enough, but Nintendo wanted more. Uemura left the key negotiations to Yamauchi himself, who boldly asked Raiko to sell their microprocessors at a mere 2,000 yen per unit. To get down to this absurd level of pricing, chip production will have to be in the order of millions, a number of video game systems rarely achieve in Japan. But Yamauchi was ready to bet on and guarantee millions of units, and that left Raiko executives worried. It is once again Hiro Matsuyagi, the ex-Mitsubishi employee, that reminds everyone that the Nintendo TV game units had sold at least 1 million units, and that the Game & Watch was a local phenomenon in Japan, and this was enough to convince his bosses to take the insane offer. The project had its manufacturer. For the games, Uemura's team found inspiration in another phenomenon taking place in Japan. The Walkman revolution had normalized the idea and aesthetics of cassette tapes as interchangeable units of media, and Uemura originally intended Famicom games to be the exact size of a cassette so people could reuse common cassette holders, but cost limitations on the size of the pins killed this idea. Almost everything else from the Famicom was decided by Uemura's team trying to save on cost. The controller was attached to the console to save on ports, the cable was shortened to save on cost, and even the color was the cheapest option. What was a significant source of issues was the controller. This was way before any standard for controllers had emerged. Console controllers were all over the place, and the closest inspiration most Nintendo R&D2 designers had in mind was the Atari controller. But this had several issues. The stick was expensive to build and prone to hurting someone or breaking if left on the floor, so a better and cheaper alternative was needed. Thankfully, the answer was provided to Uemura from within Nintendo. While attempting to quench Yamauchi's never-ending desire for more Game & Watch products, Uemura's rival, Game & Watch creator and Nintendo current superstar Gunpei Yoko was asked to design a Game & Watch adaptation of the hit arcade game. The problem was how to adapt the arcade joystick. Some of Yokoi's attempts to solve the problem, such as a tiny joystick covered with rubber, will lead to undesired results. Apparently, employees at Nintendo will dub this one the Opai Cara Controla, the boob-shaped controller, so yeah, that was not going to work. So he replaced it with 4 buttons, one for each direction. But since Yokoi was concerned that there was no tactile way to feel which direction you were going to, he added a hard plastic cross, and he invented the D-pad, quite possibly the most influential input method for games ever. Funnily enough, he had no idea what he had just invented, to the point that when a Nintendo employee from the legal department asked him to sign the document to patent it, he said he was too busy and just to sign it himself. So it is the name of that legal assistant, Ichiro Shirai, the one that will appear in the patent to this day instead of Yokoi's. Wow. Uemura did not like the idea of asking Yokoi for help, but desperate to meet his deadline, he ignored his pride and asked him to help implement a similar mechanism for his console. For the moment, it's interesting how that D-pad will become basically one of the standards for video games for basically forever, with no major exceptions. Oh fuck, I had completely forgotten about this. Why do you keep doing this to Nintendo? Why?
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
All in all, Uemura's team had produced a miracle of a machine in terms of features for the cost. And still, the final price of the unit came to 14,800 yen, significantly over the draconian 10,000 limited by Yamauchi. But just enough for Yamauchi to accept it and approve the product to move into production. After all, he was aware the console was going to be sold with the tiniest margins for the sake of being as cheap as possible, and that the real moneymaker would be the games. Uemura had done it. All it was missing was a name. The term console had not really entered the mainstream Japanese lexicon at that moment, so any console-like device that played video games will simply be called a computer. And then Uemura's wife had a great idea. If a PC was meant to mean personal computer, and this new device is a game computer meant for the living room for all the family to enjoy, how about family computer? Hey, you could even shorten it to Famicom, and it will sound nice. The history behind the name hides an interesting hint about the strategy behind the console. Uemura and his team were very aware that for their device to work, it needed to find appeal beyond children and into the whole family. This philosophy also guided the selection of a lot of the first set of games for the console, some of which were strategically chosen to appeal better to parents. And the name Family Computer accurately captured this intent rather well. And while it went through some extra trials and tribulations, the Famicom became a huge hit. The biggest hit Nintendo had ever seen at that moment. And so, attention turned to Yokoi, who was expected to come up with a successor to the Game & Watch. By 1984, Nintendo's R&D1 was already experimenting with screen technologies that will allow them to create a successor. Their main concern was to find a suitable screen to build the entire console around. There are vestiges of those priorities of the project back then, even at the final device. Dot matrix screen. What's a dot matrix screen? Well, any screen that is made up of a matrix of dots that can be programmed into showing any image at a certain resolution. So, like pixels? Like every screen you have ever used? And like the one you're using to watch this video right now? Yup. Well, this is a weird distinction to be made by modern standards and was likely already a bit outdated as a feature by its release. In 1987, when the project started taking shape inside Nintendo, most twisted nematic screens were segmented displays, like the ones you could find in a watch. But just around that time, the Japanese LCD market was making great progress in moving to dot matrix systems, thanks to the rise of personal assistants. Consider the following. A traditional segmented display can easily be used to represent any number or letter on the alphabet, but what do you do when your language involves symbols like this one? This market pressure, mixed with LCD leadership, led to products like the Sharp PA7000, a relatively inexpensive digital assistant with a 2-line dot matrix screen that could display readable kanji. In fact, it appears it was one of these very devices that was first disassembled and used to hack together the earliest concept device of the Game Boy. At this point, Yamauchi had officially greenlit the project and demanded the rather difficult task of figuring out how to make the device doable for under 10,000 yen. Before a single decision was made in terms of RAM or CPU, the team at Nintendo R&D1 started by looking for the perfect screen for the project, as it should have not been too complicated to find a supplier on the saturated LCD market. Turns out this was a bit more complicated than anticipated. This is the History of Nintendo Volume 4, a book that chronicles the development history of the Game Boy based on direct interviews from ex-members of Nintendo R&D1 and research all conducted by Florent Gorges. I'm not good at pronunciation, so I will let him do it.
So my name is Florent Gorges and I live in France, and I'm actually a translator from Japanese to French. I translated many mangas like The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Manga Adventures, Splatoon. I also created many publishing companies, and the last one I created is Omake Books, which actually publish a lot of video game books, official biographies, etc.
This book has been one of my main sources for this video, and I reached out to Florent during my research to better understand some of the stories that contextualize the technology behind the Game Boy, starting with the screen selection. Even though Nintendo already had a deep relationship with LCD maker Sharp, they decided to shop around and contact several other companies that could make such a screen. The Japanese takeover of the industry meant that there were far from a small number of companies able to do this. Matsushita, nowadays known as Panasonic, Optoplex, Hoshiden, Citizen, and Seiko Epson were all contacted. Panasonic ghosted Nintendo, Optoplex was not interested in working with them, and Hoshiden and Seiko, although initially interested, ghosted them too. At the time, Nintendo was mostly known in Japan as a toy maker, far from the gaming behemoth that they will become. One company, however, showed a lot of interest. Citizen, the calculator and watchmaker company, immediately sent a representative to Nintendo to demonstrate their advances, and R&D was stunned. They offered 2 dot matrix screens using twisted nematic technology that could be made as cheap as 1,300 yen per unit for monochromatic and 3,900 for color. The decision was not difficult. The color screen was 3 times as expensive and used many times more energy. If they wanted a cheap handheld with usable battery life, it had to be a monochromatic screen. Considering Yokoi's famous philosophy of preferring cheaper, reliable technology that provided a better experience, the decision was not questioned. Sharp, which had worked with Nintendo for over 10 years at that point, could not match that, and after further negotiation, Citizen will be able to drop their price even further. After a visit of the general director of Citizen to the offices of Nintendo, it was all set. All that was missing was simply signing the contract. And that was it. The rest is history. Or was it? As a delegation from Citizen leaves, into the offices walks a surprise delegation from Sharp. They had an emergency meeting with President Yamauchi, and they were out for blood. No one that still lives, or is willing to talk, knows what happened at that meeting. What we know is that Yamauchi ordered Yokoi to cancel all arrangements with Citizen, and that the Game Boy screen will be made by Sharp. Was Sharp desperate not to lose its relationship with Nintendo? Did they promise a technology or prices that they could yet not achieve? The world might never know. However, there's a super interesting ending to this part of the story. Canceling arrangements with a business partner so late into the game.
In corporate culture, this is considered a dick move.
Now elevate that to the infamous Japanese business culture, and Yokoi could not find a way to tell Citizen the bad news. So he just got someone from his team, Yoshihiro Taki, one of the technical brains of the Game Boy project, to do it. Desperate, Taki came up with a plan. He twisted the truth a bit and made up a story where sure, Sharp will be the ones doing the screen for the Game Boy, but that a few months later they will start working on another handheld, this time using Citizen's expensive color LCD. Taki even went as far as creating a detailed document with the technical specifications and architecture of this color version of their handheld. Taki knew this project was not viable due to their high price and power usage of the screen, but he needed a way out. He delivered the document to Citizen with his apologies and told them to expect to hear back from Nintendo to get started on the project later on. And then he ghosted them and hoped they will take the hint. This is like a high school level breakup, Jesus Christ. A little over a year after the release of the Game Boy, Sega releases the Game Gear using a Citizen color screen. Taki of course buys one to disassemble it, and imagine his surprise when the device suspiciously matches a lot of the fake designs he had given to Citizen. His contacts at Citizen of course denied ever using any of that, and simply claimed they have taken their product to Nintendo's Japanese rival after they were ghosted, so... Was Taki's knowingly flawed fake design actually one of the things that led to the Game Gear? Nintendo betraying a technological partner who bitterly decides to continue the project to compete with them out of pure spite. Where have I heard this before? The source of this story was Yoshihiro Taki himself, who told them to Florent during a lengthy set of interviews in Japan, and as Florent quite aptly puts it, Taki was not the type of person to make things up.
And I had the chance to meet Mr. Taki. The first hour of our interviews, I was very surprised because he showed me a few notebooks and he told me, you see that? It's my professional diary. And I have written every day of my Nintendo works, every day of my career. I wrote down what I did on the day, what we decided, etc. Of course, it was Mr. Taki's point of view. It was his work. But there was so many incredible information from that time. He cannot lie about this. So this incredible Citizen and Sharp story is written down. And there is all the names of the people involved in this story inside. Of course, I could not reveal everything because there was some stories we can't share.
Either way, let's get back on track. With the screen now being Sharp's problem to solve, R&D1 got busy coming up with the rest of the Game Boy's technology, which should have been a pretty smooth sailing. And of course, it wasn't. Back then, and for God knows how long, the different departments of Nintendo were competing pretty dramatically for the attention of the president.
Mr. Hiroshi Yamauchi, he was the kind of businessman who liked to make all his teams like rivals. Because if you become rival, you want to do better than your rival. And so everybody is, fighting at each other.
Yokoi did not approve of all the attention the Famicom was getting.
He created so many toys which helped Nintendo to survive when they faced a lot of big crises. So Mr. Yokoi was the star of Nintendo at that time. But after the success of Mr. Uemura, the Famicom became so big that Mr. Yokoi's R&D became just down the Uemura R&D department. When Mr. Okada got the idea of making a new Game & Watch, but not a Game & Watch, but a handheld Famicom, Mr. Yokoi did not agree with that. He didn't want to hear one word about Famicom.
He did not like the direction Nintendo was taking, away from the fun and innovative simple toys he had loved to design, of which the Game & Watch was probably the most complex, towards Famicom-style game consoles that require more complicated technology and bigger game development efforts.
Mr. Yokoi was very disappointed because Mr. Yokoi was absolutely not a specialist in electronic, but he was very strong in mechanic. And during 10 years, 15 years, Nintendo and Yokoi created a lot of mechanical toys. But after the success of the Famicom, it became high-tech technological inventions.
His vision for the Game Boy were closer to a direct successor of the Game & Watch, a simpler device that could switch between different simple game cartridges. He even considered the idea of shipping games with cutouts to place on a screen, similar to what the Magnavox consoles had done during their time. It was a toy meant to last for a couple of seasons at best. However, this vision for the project was not exactly popular with everyone, and soon a rift will form on the Game Boy team. Satoru Okada was the second in command for R&D1, an engineer that had been brought in to assist with Yokoi's lack of computer electronic knowledge. He viewed the project as an opportunity to do, essentially, a pocket Famicom, a device able to deliver games as complex and deep as Nintendo's Star console, but in a portable format. For Yokoi, trying to make his project closer to the Famicom was an admission of defeat, and for months he fought to impose his vision of the project.
He didn't want it to make a portable Famicom, because it means that if they create a handheld Famicom, it means that the Famicom is better
Okada's pure stubbornness prevailed. After a lot of shouting during a meeting, Yokoi gave up and allowed Okada to take the lead of the project. It is very difficult to imagine how different the Game Boy would have been if this had gone differently. Both men did agree on Yokoi's view regarding screen technology though. For the device to succeed, it had to be monochromatic, cheap, and use little power for usable battery life. Those who sided with Yokoi continued to work on the Game Boy screen, while those who sided with Okada continued to work on the CPU and general architecture of the device. The R&D's 2 Famicom had been such a success that Nintendo was caught off guard when other companies wanted to create games for it. So this time, they will make a platform easier for third parties to develop on, so it will make sense to also make it as similar to the Famicom as possible. It will have been a logical move and will have allowed to streamline the development of games using the Famicom tools.
And the NES came with a 6502. Super NES came with a 816, which is the 16-bit version of that same CPU. So obviously, the Game Boy comes with a sharp LR35902.
However, the internal rivalry stuck again. Uemura blocked Okada from being able to contact Raiko, the company that made the Famicom CPU. Raiko was currently busy working on the powerful 16-bit Super Famicom, and he will not risk them getting distracted over wasting resources on an outdated monochromatic handheld. So they once again went to Sharp and asked them if they could do the CPU as well. The result is the Sharp LR35902. So remember when earlier in the video explained how there were basically 2 super popular 8-bit CPUs and how all Nintendo arcade hits were running on the Zilog, but because of weird trademark bullshit, the Famicom ended up using a clone of the 6502? Well, now that Okada wished the Game Boy to have something like the 6502 to facilitate porting of Famicom games, Sharp was instead forced to use a modified clone of the Zilog C80. Man, they could not catch a break with their attempts at consistency. At this point, the project was pretty much set and moving ahead, but it was not long before disaster struck once again. To say that the Game Boy project was unpopular among Nintendo's staff outside of R&D 1 was a huge understatement. The insistence on a cheap monochromatic screen was a tremendously controversial decision. Japan's LCD industry was quickly advancing towards color screens, and the idea of releasing a device that looked so outdated was seen by many as a mistake. The project, which was known internally as Dot Matrix Game, quickly gained other names. Damegemu, or terrible game in Japanese, or the English word damages, a reference to the damage many believe the device will do to Nintendo. It all boiled down to an eventful meeting around 1988 when the official prototype was presented to Yamauchi. The result was catastrophic, apparently due to a single reason: viewing angles. Let's go back to twisted nematic screens for a second. A dot matrix screen is made up by hundreds of crystal arrangements like this in a pixel matrix. For these cheap screens, the technology was not quite there for addressing each pixel individually, but rather they will be connected to what is known as a passive matrix, when applying voltage to a pixel meant applying it to the pins of the corresponding row and column. The problem with this method is that there's a limit to how much voltage each pixel will see, determined by this formula. For 100 pixels, the voltage difference between on and off was barely over 10%, meaning that when the pixel is supposed to be off, it will see, for example, 1.9 volts, and when it's on, it will see 2.1 volts at best. How is this a problem? The more voltage you apply to a twisted nematic liquid crystal, the less light it lets through, and therefore the sharper the contrast. The sharper the contrast, the better the viewing angles. This is a graph representing how much a twisted liquid crystal rotates based on voltage, where this is how much the crystal twists as an angle and this is voltage. With such a small voltage difference, the rotation between on and off was very small, and the more pixels you had on screen, the worse the contrast got. And the contrast gets worse at an angle, so the worse the contrast, the worse the viewing angle. Yamauchi was so unimpressed at how difficult it was to find the correct angle for the screen to be visible that he called for the cancellation of the Game Boy project immediately. These were dark times in the history of Nintendo R&D 1. According to Gunpei Yokoi's biography, the prospect of disappointing yet another business partner over another cancellation drew him to consider suicide. But according to interviews with Taki conducted by Florent, what drew him to this deep depression was the sense of betrayal. President Yamauchi's decision was way too sudden to be purely based on that demonstration. In Taki's view, certain unnamed people at Nintendo were using the Game Boy's internal unpopularity to sabotage the project, and undermine Yokoi as he was once a likely candidate for taking over the company once Yamauchi retired. Either way, the Game Boy project was officially cancelled over this viewing angle issue, and most people in R&D 1 were reassigned to other projects. Some employees, including Yokoi and Taki, continued to work in secret, trying to find a way to save the Game Boy. But remember, Nintendo means leave luck to heaven. And a few weeks later, the heavens seemed ready for another miracle. Back in 1982, an improvement to the twisted nematic displays were invented, which has a fantastic name.
Supertwisted Nematic!
Thanks to the improvements in the material, it was now possible to fabricate a similar system where, at rest, the crystals are twisted several times over. What does this change? Rather than slowly untwisted as more voltage is added, like in a regular twisted pneumatics, super twisted crystals retain their shape for much higher voltages until a certain threshold is reached, and then they all suddenly untwist. That means even with a passive matrix, where the difference of voltage between on and off is very small, the difference in contrast between the on and off pixel was much higher. And much better contrast means much better viewing angles. By the late 80s, a contact at Sharp let Taki know in secret about the fact that they were preparing to start setting up a production line for super twisted nematic screens. And Taki immediately called Yokoi to tell him that the heavens had once again delivered. With the surprising discreet help of Sharp and a few favors of the factory engineers, a new prototype was made and presented to Yamauchi barely 3 months after the project cancellation. The timing was really good. R&D 2 was struggling to develop the Super Famicom, and Nintendo had to delay the release of their next generation console. That did not bode well for sales. Having another product that was nearly ready to start manufacturing was just what Nintendo needed. Rather than being upset that the project he had cancelled had continued in secret, Yamauchi was satisfied with progress and approved its revival. The Game Boy was back on. It will still take work to get the product ready for the market, such as extensive testing by the quality control department of the Uji factory that refined the design until it became so resilient to damage that it has become a bit of an internet legend. But the details of the technology were set. At release, the green monochromatic screen raised a few eyebrows among the press, especially in a country that was slowly getting accustomed to products using color LCD screens. But Yokoi's stubbornness on keeping the screen monochromatic for battery life delivered in spades. The Game Boy was cheaper and used fewer AA batteries than competitors. Also, its battery life was so dramatically better that it was difficult to compare. Okada's insistence on making the system a true, fully fledged pocket console and his foresight on making it easy for third parties to develop on also delivered. Simple cartridges holding ROM chips, bank controls and battery backups for saves were enough for most games, and developers quickly figured out ways of working around the limitations of the system, to the point that for a few months after release, Nintendo had to reverse engineer how some of the third parties were putting some of their visual tracks on the console they had developed. So, as they had hoped, the device immediately sold out on the back of games like Super Mario Land, and led to widespread shortages all over Japan. What was already an extraordinarily successful device went into Super Saiyan mode with the introduction of what would become the most successful video game of all time, and the frankly galaxy brain move by Nintendo of America of packing the Game Boy with Tetris instead of Mario, which ensured the device will sell and sell and sell. The Game Boy team and RD1 welcomed the news. The development of the device had been an absolute nightmare, and many of them were not eager to jump into the grinder yet again. Division leader Gunpei Yoko was worn out from all the infighting, betrayal, and drama that dominated the development of the Game Boy, to the point that it took him 2 years to come up with a new project. In reality, by his own confession in his biography, he wanted to retire from Nintendo and create a small company where he could go back to the smaller projects and toys he actually enjoyed making. Away from the high-tech mega product Nintendo was now laser focused on making. But, loyal to his sense of honor and to his company, he did not want to leave after 2 years of seemingly no progress in his work, so he decided to try one more product before he retired. Satoru Okada, his second-in-command and the one who had fought to make the Game Boy a fully fledged console and not just a toy, chose to skip out on the next project, quite possibly as exhausted with the drama as Yokoi was, and so Yokoi was ready to move to something else. No, all he needed was a key new technology that he could build this new dream product around, and one was about to walk into his front door after traveling from the other side of the world. An engineer called Alan Becker was traveling on an airplane in 1985. This was years before laptops, handheld gaming machines, or smartphones, so if you wanted to keep yourself entertained in a plane, you basically had to read a book. But Alan had forgotten to bring a book, and in his boredom, he wondered about what kind of technology would be required for a device that allowed him to continue to work or be entertained during a flight. What was holding portable computers behind were the same limitations portable screens had on cost and power consumption that the Game Boy team will eventually run into. But back in the airplane, Alan had an idea. His previous experience was on these flatbed scanners. Scanners work by using LEDs to capture one line at a time, which was way cheaper than having a sensor capture the full page. And he figured he could reverse the process to create a screen. You have probably seen the same principle in some toys out there, where you have a single line of LEDs, but when moved really fast, they can generate a full image. Now, the only problem is that the only LEDs available in the market that were cheap enough for this project were red. This will mean that the display will only be able to show a red image on a black background. I'm sure this will not be a problem at all. 6 months later, he pieced together the first prototype and raised capital to form a company and make this product a reality. The company's name? Reflection Technology Inc. And this is when we meet Steve Lipsy. Hired as Vice President of Sales and Marketing, he's now part of the team tasked on finding a problem for the solution they already had. And this will take him on quite an unexpected journey. Fall 1988, Computex Dealers Exhibition in Vegas. The tech press is buzzing and hailing the private eye as the future of computer displays. Companies left and right are reaching out to make inquiries about this must-see gadget, and nearly 100 developer kits are sold on the show. But it was all for nothing. No one could figure out how to work around its limitations. No practical use ever materialized. Wow, a headset device that is meant to give something like a heads-up display that creates a lot of hype but never materializes into a product. Why does that sound so familiar? So with the idea dead in the water, it was time for the marketing team to find a new idea. And they will find inspiration in another trend that was sweeping tech media at the time. Virtual reality. Time is a flat circle, I know. It's the early 90s that everyone was hyped about the potential of virtual reality. Reflection saw its opportunity. 2 private eyes attached to a welder's mask and a rudimentary head tracking device, plus a simple first-person tank fighting game running on a computer, made for a surprisingly affordable and capable VR headset. Before long, people in the office were lining up to play on the demo. Reflection's affordable technology made for an excellent video game device. If they wanted any chance to make it into the market, they will need to partner with someone different. Mattel and Hasbro had both rejected the project, so they figured this was a device more appropriate for a video game company. Hopes were high as Lipsy and the marketing team walked into the Sega of America headquarters for a pitch. But Sega of America's president Tom Kalinske was not charmed. Sega was reviewing VR technology for a planned VR headset for the Sega Genesis, with Sega in full marketing swing with the Game Gear, trashing the Game Boy for its monochromatic screen. They could not just go and release this device. They will be laughed out by their own customers. Nope, they will have to take a pass on this. The options for companies to partner with was shrinking, but Lipsy had one last card to play. His contact in Japan had managed to set up one final meeting with the big boy of video games, Nintendo themselves. Before the visit, Lipsy could feel the mounting pressure of the meeting. This was during the time when Nintendo was the undisputed king of the game world and one of the biggest companies in Japan. He wondered and feared if they could find issues with his monochromatic device. But doubts started to melt as he watched a particularly eager Nintendo engineer absolutely lose his mind at the tank demo.
Wow, you really seem to like it. Excuse me, I did not catch your name. Who are you?
The name is Yokoi. Gunpei Yoko.
This was it. If he could turn this headset into a hit console for Nintendo, Yokoi could finally retire happy and satisfied. Recalling the uphill battle that was convincing the company to go for the limited screen of the Game Boy, he was not intimidated by the device's limited color palette. He felt darkness made it up by totally immersing players in a way never before possible. As Nintendo executives meet to accept or reject Lipsy's pitch, his nerves continue to rise. He might have won the approval of Yokoi, but on the other side of the table sat an intimidating man, none other than Nintendo president and resident business maverick Hiroshi Yamauchi. As Lipsy continued with his presentation, the lack of reaction from Yamauchi begins to concern him.
Man, this guy, he is unreadable. Truly a colossus among Japanese businessmen, perfectly trained not to give away any leverage. His expression so still that you would almost imagine he was not in this meeting at all. Did he just fall asleep?
Well, the president of the company falling asleep in the middle of a presentation seemed like a pretty big red flag. It seemed that Yamauchi had long decided to leave this in the hands of his subordinates, and give Yokoi, who had so far not delivered a bad product, whatever he wanted. Or maybe he was just bored out of his mind. Yamauchi's actions are often confusing to understand. After the meeting, Nintendo paid $10 million in advance royalties, bought a minority stake in Reflection Technologies, and bought the exclusive license for this technology in video games. Yokoi had been given the go-ahead to create his last hit product. His vision was of a wearable standalone headset running an efficient, low-wattage 32-bit RISC processor that would allow players to immerse themselves completely in games, all wrapped up in a catchy name, the Virtual Boy. The portability of a Game Boy with virtual reality capabilities, a concept that sounds shockingly familiar. While Yokoi's philosophy was usually one of reusing well-understood technology to great effect, this time he had given himself some room to dream of the future. But soon enough, the limitations of the present came back to haunt him. Nowadays, wireless always online gadgets attached to every part of our bodies are a fact of life, but back in the mid-90s there was serious concerns about the effects of radio frequency radiation on the body, and Nintendo engineers were concerned about selling a device chock full of radiation-emitting chips on kids' heads. Deciding to play it safe, a metal plate was added on top of the CPU to block all radiation, but this made the device so heavy that it was difficult to strap to the head. Maybe they should have just wrapped their heads in tinfoil, clearly. Untethered, Yokoi came up with a shoulder device that will allow the heavier headset, but this idea stared something deep in Nintendo's offices and awoke an ancient evil from the darkness. Nintendo's legal department. You see, Japan was about to introduce a law that will make companies very liable for accidents that could happen because of a product. On one hand, experts hired by Nintendo had determined that the 3D technology was harmless to the eye, except in the very specific case of young children if the lenses had any significant vertical misalignment. While vertical misalignments on this rigid device was nearly impossible, the legal team panicked at the idea of Nintendo being liable for any damage and advised towards covering the manuals with warnings and disclaimers of the potential dangers of the device, and went as far as to enforce a 15-minute timer that constantly reminded users to take a break. But the worst part was the mere idea of a kid walking around with one of these devices completely blind to the world. It was terrifying. What if a kid will fall down the stairs while walking? Can you imagine the headlines, the lawsuits?
Somebody please think of the children!
This will not do. Guided by the legal department, the device lost its wearable qualities and became a device mounted on a stand. All vestiges of the original virtual reality design lost. And at this point, alarms were going off in Yokoi's head. With the device losing all semblance of its original portable design, everyone will compare it with the consoles rather than handhelds. He had seen what their rival console division was developing, a 64-bit console capable of really impressive 3D graphics. If the Virtual Boy was compared side by side to this, he was going to be in trouble. But he had the support of President Yamauchi, who had led him to run the project in the first place, and he hoped he still had enough favor to ask him to delay the project just enough so he could accommodate for the new design. 1994, as Hiroshi Yamauchi reads the company's reports, he was restless. Longtime rival Sega was about to launch their next-gen console, a device capable of impressive 3D graphics, and Sony had been so pissed off about Nintendo breaking their relationship that they were about to enter the market with their own console. Nintendo was originally ready to respond with their own 3D-capable hardware until the console team had hit major development snags that delayed the project, potentially giving Nintendo's enemies years to establish themselves in the 3D market before Nintendo could make its move. He needed something, anything that Nintendo could market quickly to at least hold some place in the 3D market.
Excuse me, Yamauchi-san.
So that's how that feels.
Sir, I have come to talk about the Virtual Boy's release date.
Ah, Yokoi, you genius! I need you to release that 3D-capable console immediately!
Immediately? But I wanted to redesign the hardware. I haven't even talked to Miyamoto about games.
Miyamoto is very busy with some 3D Mario thing. Look, your team can make games, right? Make some!
As the Virtual Boy was finally shown to the public at the 1994 Shoshinkai Software Exhibition in Harumi, Japan, the public was confused. Just as Yokoi had feared, the project had divagated so far from its original intention that the name Virtual Boy was more confusing than exciting, as reporters wonder why this was being passed as a virtual reality device. The rush game lineup and particularly the high price in the ballpark of more exciting 3D consoles meant that the device was set for a rough launch. Still, given Nintendo's game design reputation, some wonder if, given enough time, hit games will materialize for the system. But all hope vanished when the device manuals, filled with the warnings that the legal department had required, leaked to the press, which quickly created a narrative about this device being something that will destroy a player's eyes. 5 months after release, the platform was officially discontinued in Japan, and Nintendo quickly tried to move on to the Nintendo 64 and forget the Virtual Boy ever happened. In fact, if it weren't for the brilliant journalistic work of people like Benji Edwards at Fast Company, most of these details will be lost to history, as it remains the worst commercial failure of all Nintendo platforms. If Yokoi did not want to leave Nintendo after 2 years of no new products, living in the middle of his worst failure was even worse, especially considering the generalized nervousness inside Nintendo at the time. The Super Famicom from his rival Uemura had been a success, but had not quite lived up to the astronomical sales of the original Famicom, and his team was really struggling to develop the follow-up, the Nintendo 64. Exhausted, Yokoi started wondering, what would be a product easy and quick to develop that will work as a surefire success and allow him to leave the company with his pride intact? As Yokoi wondered where his easy ticket out of Nintendo might be, a seemingly unrelated conversation with a friend during 1995 brought some unexpected inspiration. Something interesting was happening in Japan in the 90s, and I just do not mean whatever the commercial makers were drinking. Their advances in portable electronics were ushering a golden era of mobile phones years before the rest of the world. Yokoi noticed that his friend had bought a mobile phone, which was odd because his friend had long resisted the idea of getting such a device. The friend explained that he had been avoiding phones because he found them bulky and uncomfortable, but that during the last years, affordable phones had finally become small enough that they could fit in the palm of his hand. And there it was, the insight he so desperately needed, the simple idea that will allow him to finally retire. He will make the Game Boy again, but smaller. A Game Boy that could fit in a shirt pocket. This is the Game Boy Pocket. Compared to the chaos of developing the original bulky Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket was easy. The general insides of the device could only need a light redo, and only one major change will be needed to make the device dramatically smaller, as the thing that occupied the most space on the original Game Boy was actually the battery. When I first noticed this, I spent way too long doing some major research trying to figure out how was this achieved. After all, the whole freaking point of the original Game Boy was to prioritize battery life, so they must have done some pretty crazy power optimization on this device to cut battery requirements this dramatically. Was it a new CPU, more efficient memory, a more efficient RAM? Nope. Not at all. As usual, the answer was staring at me right along. The disposable AA and AAA batteries we all know and maybe love had been in circulation since 1907. Wow, okay, yeah, I was very surprised too. These batteries were not good. The materials were not particularly energy dense, and as the zinc was used up, it tended to break and leak very easily. It was a mess. Luckily, in 1950, a Canadian chemical engineer called Lewis Urey was working on a replacement to this ancient design that much improved the chemical reaction and added an alkaline dielectric. All in all, its energy storage was 2 times larger or even more than previous batteries at the time, and came to be known simply as alkaline batteries. Urey had to work for decades to improve its design, as people in his company didn't quite believe this will be a success at all. But by the 80s, Lewis finally nailed a design for the batteries that his company commercialized, and it became so successful that nowadays it is difficult to find disposable batteries that are not alkaline. Oh, by the way, that company Urey invented this for, the one that didn't quite believe this project would actually be that impactful, it's called Energizer. You might have heard of them. alkaline batteries quickly took over the entire disposable battery industry, and it was truly a revolution. Suddenly, the most popular AA batteries in every store from the US to Japan lasted 3 times as long. Thanks to Energizer and its batteries, the original Game Boy rose to a dramatic 30 hours of battery life, way past the targets of what R&D1 intended. So even using 2 batteries instead of 4 and a smaller, lower capacity AAA batteries, the newer Game Boy could significantly be smaller and still have more than 10 hours of battery life. And so R&D1 figured, why not use a bit of that power to improve some of the most controversial aspects of the original Game Boy? Remember that bit earlier in the video where I explained how the passive matrix of the original Game Boy was the source of its contrast issues? The problem was well known to the entire LCD industry well before the first LCD products. Back in 1957, engineers at RCA were trying to figure out a way to add tiny transparent transistors to a panel of glass to be able to directly apply voltage to each pixel to bypass this problem. A method known as active matrix. Transistors, on the most basic level, can act as electronically controlled switches, which gives each pixel its own control mechanism. The theory was solid, but in practice they were very difficult to manufacture in scale. And it was not until the development of a material known as amorphous silicon in the University of Dundee in Scotland that the Japanese display industry went, and started doing research that will make thin film transistors into an extremely popular but expensive technology for consumer products. By the time the 90s rolled around, the technology had matured so much that Sharp could supply Nintendo with TFT screens at acceptable lower prices, and only with a modest increase in power consumption, which was easily compensated by the change to alkaline batteries. The new screen was combined with improvements to the plexiglass used to protect the screen, which changed to a new material that was equally resistant while being more transparent and light. R&D1 engineers felt confident enough that they could meet battery life targets while still selling a much smaller and better device. The only question left was if the device will succeed at the level necessary for Yokoi to happily retire with a win. This was not an insignificant concern. The original Game Boy was already relatively technologically weak at release, and the industry has started the process of moving towards the exciting world of 3D gaming. Game Boy handhelds and game sales had both started to slow down, and third-party support was waning, and it was not a surefire thing that the Pocket was enough to revitalize all of that. Once again, the history of Nintendo Volume 4, which I keep referencing on this video, reveals how ultimately the success of the Pocket was basically down to timing and luck. President Yamauchi was unconvinced the device will revitalize sales without some dramatic measures and demanded the device be sold at 6,800 yen. Considering this was nearly half the target price of the original Game Boy, this put some unexpected pressure on what was supposed to be a fairly easy project and led to some intense debates inside the team as to what functions to cut to achieve this. And one of the most controversial issues was the cable link port. One of the selling points of the original Game Boy was the link cable, an optional accessory that allowed multiplayer action between two devices. Every meeting turned into a fight as the hardware and software team could not agree on the destiny of the link cable. The hardware team, led by an engineer of rising influence called Takehiro Isushi, argued that barely any games were selling because of the link cable, and the port was a significant source of cost for the device. For the software team, the idea of removing that was ludicrous, as the link cable was one of the strongest distinguishing features of the Game Boy, and it will break full compatibility with a large variety of games. Ultimately, Isushi and the hardware team compromised and agreed to include a link cable port that was smaller and cheaper, as they figured the link cable would not be used enough by people for that to become a problem. You know, what could possibly require the link cable that badly? Well, funny story about that. While this whole debate was happening, Nintendo was running a trade show called the Space World. That year, all eyes were set on the reveal of the Nintendo 64, Nintendo's first fully 3D capable console. Almost entirely forgotten, in a corner, a booth for a small third-party game stood. The company making the game had started as a game magazine publisher, of all things, and had a few years ago pivoted towards game development, making a few projects for the Super Famicom, the Game Boy, and even the Sega Mega Drive. And now the company was trying to show its original new IP to a largely uninterested public. A new unknown IP from a relatively unknown company on an outdated portable handheld that was reaching the tail end of its life was not exactly competition for the hype around the Nintendo 64. That new IP for the Game Boy was fucking Pokemon Red and Blue. If you weren't alive or active in video game circles in the 90s, it is difficult to correctly express just how popular Pokemon was. Remember that glorious month in 2016 when Pokemon Go first released and the entire world seemed to stop just to play the damn game? Okay, imagine that for 5 freaking straight years. Pokemon didn't just revitalize the Game Boy marketplace, it drove it to new heights that eclipsed all previous successes, and generated a bigger second wave of interest, and more importantly, its deep integration with the link cable and the trade functionality meant it quickly became the killer app for the Game Boy and the link cable. With Pokemon releasing a few months before the Game Boy Pocket, its success largely and instantly made the Game Boy Pocket the hottest product coming from Nintendo that generation, and it gave the software team and R&D1 much reason to gloat at the hardware team that nearly took the cable link port out. In fact, on the interviews conducted by Florent, Isushi mentions that to this day, every time he crosses paths with Satoshi Tajiri, the director of the Pokemon games, he recalls how much he fought to remove the link cable port and experiences a significant amount of past cringe. Nevertheless, the Game Boy Pocket was a huge success that conditioned Nintendo to release mid-life versions of their handhelds for the rest of freaking eternity, and it was the success Gunpei Yoko desperately needed and waited for. Barely weeks after the release of the Pocket, Yokoi handed his resignation to President Yamauchi, and no amount of effort from the president could change his mind. Yokoi's resignation caused some mixed reactions within the company. Some, like Yoshihiro Taki, the very same engineer that had the difficult task of ghosting Citizen and might have accidentally contributed to the design of the Game Gear, left Nintendo with Yokoi to form Kotolab, a small company where they could work on smaller toys and have more control over the project. For others like Satoru Okada, who had ruined his friendship with Yokoi to make the Game Boy closer to a Pocket Famicom, and Masayuki Uemura, the leader of the rival Famicom division, it was a bit of a relief. It was obvious that Yokoi was uncomfortable with Nintendo as a gaming company and that he did not feel at ease playing the internal game of politics that was necessary to get projects done inside the company. Sadly, the story of Yokoi does not get the happy ending he wanted or deserved. A bit over a year after leaving Nintendo and founding Kotolab, Yokoi had a tragic traffic accident and passed away, leaving the reins of all the projects at Koto to Taki, who had so loyally followed him from Nintendo. Outside of Japan, we often know Yokoi as the father of the Game Boy, a title that might obscure too much of the enormous contributions of others like Okada, who led the vision of what the Game Boy could actually be. But in Japan, Yokoi is known by a title that maybe he will have appreciated a bit more: the God of Toys, a reference to the many, many inventions through which he contributed to the childhood of millions. Back at Nintendo, the direction of R&D1 was led in the hands of the director of hardware, Isushi, the very same guy who had almost got the link cable removed. And while he was shocked by Yokoi's death, the team continued working. The improvements in battery life using alkaline batteries were so good, they realized that they could, using more modern screens, go back to using AA batteries and conceivably include a backlight to play without the need of an external light. To everyone inside R&D1, this will have been the last and definite iteration of the Game Boy, the perfect distillation of the 8-bit handheld before moving on to a better technology. Even before Yokoi's departure, several people in R&D1 had started working on what they called Project Atlantis, a new generation Game Boy that will replace the obsolete 8-bit CPU by a 32-bit ARM CPU, and finally add the one thing the original device had been so criticized for: a color screen. With such improvements, the Atlantis will not only match a Super Famicom in power, but possibly exceed it in a handheld format. It will be better than a Game Boy. It will be a Game Boy, but more advanced. As the Game Boy Light project wrapped up, everyone was eager to move on to Atlantis, but they were all of them deceived, for another handheld was made. Deep in the lands of Kyoto, in the fires of Koto Laboratory, before dying, the game master Yokoi had started forging a master handheld. And into this handheld he poured his knowledge, his philosophy, and his will to entertain all life. One handheld to rule them all. Was that a bit too much? It is 1998 and President of Nintendo Hiroshi Yamauchi was feeling a bit nervous. The initial sales of the Nintendo 64 in Japan had been disappointing. His corporate stunt with Sony during the development of the disc drive for the Super Famicom, a story that we made an entire video about, had backfired catastrophically, and now Sony had joined the console race with the PlayStation, which was already showing signs of being a true issue for Nintendo. Still, the company was not in any danger. Their grasp on the handheld market with the Game Boy was still absolute. Sega and many others had tried competing with Nintendo there and failed terribly for the same two reasons. No other company had the unique combination of recognizable IPs that Nintendo had, plus a collecting frenzy franchise like Pokemon, plus the vision to understand that the handheld market was won not by bleeding-edge technology, but with Yokoi's philosophy of low cost and battery life. And then Yamauchi received a courtesy call by none other than Bandai. It was an old Japanese custom to inform your business partners when you were about to make a move that will affect your relationship with them. And Bandai had been a powerful ally of the Game Boy. But the news they were bringing was basically the worst thing Yamauchi could have possibly expected. Bandai was working on a handheld to compete with the Game Boy. Okay, so Bandai did not have Mario or Zelda, but they had exclusive rights for Dragon Ball, One Piece, and pretty much every major action anime name in Japan at the time. Oh, but they did not have Pokemon, right? They had no franchise that could possibly compete with... Oh no. Oh wait, but Bandai isn't a hardware company, right? They do not have the expertise to make a device. And if they even try, they will make the same mistakes as everyone else, right? They do not have Yokoi's philosophy, right? And then came the real news. Bandai had hired Koto Laboratory, Yokoi's company, to design this handheld. Yokoi had been working on it before dying, and it was now in the hands of ex-Nintendo employee and Yokoi apprentice Yoshihiro Taki. Bandai had everything.
We need a Game Boy with a color screen, now!
Yamauchi-san, yes. Project Atlantis is going to go into full swing, and we are almost done with the Game Boy Light. We just need a couple of years.
You have 10 months!
Getting Project Atlantis to product in a year was impossible. The project was too early in development, and only a very simple project could get to market quick enough to beat Bandai. So, once again, and against the wishes of R&D1, they did some minimal changes to the Game Boy Light and created the Game Boy Color. To say the Game Boy Color from a technological perspective is little more than a revision is not a tremendous exaggeration. Time constraints meant that big improvements had to be axed, instead opting for a bigger memory pool to accommodate for the color sprites, a faster clock on the CPU in the hopes that it will be enough to at least make the console attractive enough until Project Atlantis could be commercialized. The biggest change, obviously, was the screen. Lucky for R&D1, they had been doing a lot of experiments on current color screen technology for Atlantis, and they could use those to retrofit the Game Boy Color. So, how does a liquid crystal display work with different colors? Hopefully you remember from earlier in the video the basic mechanics of liquid crystal displays and how they are used to let pass or block light. Put a Game Boy Color under a microscope and you will notice how each individual pixels is now divided into 3 subpixels, each one for a primary color. For cheaper and older LCDs, this was simply achieved by adding a color filter somewhere around the mechanism so that the light coming from each subpixel is as close to the primary color as possible. Now, this technique comes with several challenges in terms of power consumption. For starters, having to draw essentially 3 times as many pixels means 3 times as much power. Furthermore, some light is lost when you pass through the color filter. If the loss is too high, the mechanism might necessitate a strong backlight at all times, which even more dramatically increases the power consumption. Add all of this up, and you can see why devices like the Game Gear had such terrible battery life. However, by the time Nintendo was researching Project Atlantis, their screen supplier Sharp had made a lot of progress in manufacturing cheap reflective color LCDs. For those screens, an improved filter that minimizes light loss is placed right before the reflector, and a color dye is added to the liquid crystal itself. All in all, around 50% of the light makes it through the circuit, which allows the device to operate without a backlight for prolonged battery life. Removing the backlight of the Game Boy Light's design was more than enough to compensate for the increased consumption of the subpixel, and so the device was deemed sufficient for 2 alkaline AA batteries. This pressure to release the Game Boy Color instead of a new generation device caused some major lack of interest in the device, at least within Nintendo. As the American launch of the Game Boy Color approached, the president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, was fairly dismayed at discovering that Nintendo had not developed a single launch game for the Game Boy Color, and the general lack of motivation from the team. After a lot of effort, he managed to convince the team to try out and port the original Super Mario Bros. For the Famicom, which was a project that could be finished in a few months. The result was Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, a sadly underrated, very interesting port of the original. Isn't it amazing how something so extraordinarily iconic as the Game Boy Color was just kinda hated by the people who made it? You can see this through the lifetime of the device. Consider the following: if you look at a list of the best-selling monochromatic Game Boy games, you see the trend that has characterized pretty much every Nintendo console, where the best-selling games are the result of efforts of their own internal software teams. So it is super interesting to notice that for the Game Boy Color, this trend suddenly breaks. Even if a good number of these games are from Nintendo franchises, there are either ports of older games or developed outside of Nintendo, which reinforces the evidence that, at least for R&D1, the Game Boy Color was an unwanted addition that they were not particularly proud of, let alone excited to make games for. However, Yamauchi's insistence seemed to pay off. While the WonderSwan was moderately successful in Japan, and to this day has a particularly dedicated fanbase, the Game Boy Color seemed to take most of its momentum away, and maintains Nintendo's iron grip on the handheld gaming market on a time when its dominance on console was slipping, possibly to never return. Sadly, with the Game Boy Color releasing barely months after the Game Boy Light, what the team believed was going to be the definite version of the handheld was cannibalized by the Color, and therefore never made enough numbers to be commercialized outside of Japan, making it extraordinarily rare and expensive to acquire. In fact, I could not find one and had to borrow some clips from friend of the channel, developer and collector Asobi, who recently released a brand new Game Boy game, Super Jetpack DX, which proves that even decades after release, the legacy of these handhelds is kept alive. For me, the Game Boy Color teaches us a simple lesson. No matter how well made a product is, a lot of its decisions often came down to impulse personal drama, and no matter how iconic it became, its creators might not be super proud of it. I hope you enjoyed this remastered compilation of videos now presented as one story. Since this video collects pieces from 6 other videos I have made, that means that if you're hungry for more, there are tons of bonus Nebula videos to watch. There is the story of how one musician was so upset with Yokoi leaving that he created the Game Boy camera to prove him that he was wrong about the direction Nintendo was going. There is the hidden tribute to Yokoi hidden in the Game Boy Color's design, the unexpected origins of Mr. Game & Watch, an exploration of the conflicting stories behind the Famicom's Color, and the original 3D headset that set up a lot of important relationships inside Nintendo. All of this are part of Sidequest, my series of side videos, all found in Nebula, a creator-owned streaming service for all our videos, plus extra content and high-quality originals like Wendover's Logistics of X. This channel is funded by those of you subscribed to Nebula, and you can get in with a heavy discount using my link, with 40% off on annual plans, which goes down to as little as $2.5 a month. Thank you for supporting this channel in Nebula.